In 1850, for the first time in American history, a census taker walked door to door and wrote down the name of every free person living in a household, not just the head of it. Wives had names in the record. Children had names. Boarders, apprentices, and elderly relatives living under someone else's roof all had names, entered by hand next to their age, their occupation, and the state or country where they were born. And beside all of that, in a column that had never appeared on a census form before, sat a dollar figure. The value of real estate owned. For some households, that column held a number in the tens of thousands of dollars, an almost unthinkable sum for the time. For most households, the column held nothing, a blank space where a fortune should have been. That single column tells you where your surname stood in 1850, whether it belonged to the class that owned the land, the mills, and the banks, or the class that worked inside them for wages. Some names turn up again and again beside five-figure real estate values in county record after county record. Others turn up again and again beside a blank column and the single word laborer. This is what those two columns reveal, and what your own name might already be telling you about 1850, a story written in ink more than 170 years ago and still sitting there, waiting, in a county archive somewhere, under your own family name. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Randolph. In Virginia in 1850, the name needed no introduction. The family descended from William Randolph of Turkey Island, a planter who settled in the colony in the 1670s, and whose sons and grandsons married into nearly every prominent household in the state. By the time census takers reached counties like Henrico and Goochland that year, Randolph households routinely showed real estate values in the tens of thousands of dollars, land that had passed down through 6 or 7 generations without ever leaving the family name. Thomas Jefferson's mother was a Randolph. John Marshall's mother descended from the same line, and so did dozens of lesser-known planters, judges, and colonels scattered across the Virginia Piedmont. The family had produced governors and congressmen and one of the largest concentrations of inherited plantation acreage anywhere in the state. Being a Randolph in 1850, Virginia was not simply a matter of being comfortable. The name functioned as a credential, one that opened doors in courtrooms, in banks, and in marriages that a stranger's name never could. The wealth recorded in that real estate column had rarely been built within a single lifetime. It was wealth someone had inherited, acreage granted under colonial patents nearly 2 centuries earlier and never permitted to leave the bloodline. Part of what protected that wealth for so long was Virginia's own legal system. Colonial inheritance law favored entail and primogeniture, rules that kept a family's land bound to a single heir rather than divided among children, and even after the Virginia legislature abolished those rules in the years following independence, families who had already consolidated their holdings under the old system simply kept what they had. A Randolph estate assembled under 17th century patents was never required to fragment the way a smaller farm might. If a Randolph branch sits somewhere in your family tree with roots in Virginia, the 1850 census will very likely show exactly how much of that original land grant the family was still holding on to, and which county courthouse still keeps the deed. Murphy. By 1850, it had become the single most common surname carried by Irish immigrants arriving in American port cities, and it told a very different story than Randolph's. Between 1845 and 1852, the Great Famine drove more than 1 million people out of Ireland, most of them tenant farmers who had never owned the land they worked in the first place. They arrived in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia with little beyond the clothes they were wearing, and the 1850 census reflects that arrival with almost mechanical consistency. Open the ward records for Lower Manhattan or the North End of Boston, and Murphy appears constantly, almost always beside the word laborer, almost always beside a blank real estate column. These were not families who had lost their land, they were families who had rarely been permitted to hold land at all, first under the penal restrictions that governed Catholic land ownership in Ireland for generations, and then under famine conditions that made ownership beside the point next to simple survival. A Murphy household in 1850 Boston might contain 8 or 9 people crowded into 2 rooms, the parents working as a laborer and a domestic servant, the older children already sent out to earn wages of their own instead of attending school. The arrival of so many Murphys and families like them was not welcomed quietly either. By the early 1850s, resentment toward Irish Catholic newcomers had grown into an organized political movement, one that would soon call itself the American Party, and that Americans of the time nicknamed the Know-Nothings, built almost entirely around the idea that immigrant labor and immigrant Catholicism threatened the country. A Murphy family was arriving into an economy that badly needed its labor and a political culture that often resented its presence at the very same time. The name that would later become one of the most recognizable in America began its American chapter at the very bottom of the real estate column, with nothing entered there at all. Livingston. The name traces to Robert Livingston, a Scottish-born merchant who arrived in the Hudson Valley in the 1670s and secured a land patent that would eventually become Livingston Manor, one of the great manorial estates of colonial New York. By 1850, his descendants were still sitting on portions of that original grant, their real estate entries in Columbia and Dutchess counties running into the tens of thousands of dollars at a time when most Americans owned no real estate at all. The family had produced Robert R. Livingston, who administered the oath of office to George Washington in 1789 and later helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the nation while his own family's landholdings back home remained entirely untouched. Livingston sat on bank boards, married into other manorial families like the Van Rensselaers and the Schoolers, and treated New York politics as something close to a family business across 5 generations. The manorial system itself dated back further still, to a Dutch charter of freedoms and exemptions issued in the 1620s to encourage wealthy investors to settle the Hudson Valley by granting them enormous estates and near total authority over the tenants who farmed them. Livingston Manor was one of the last and largest of these grants to survive intact into the 19th century, long after Dutch rule itself had ended. The census taker who walked up to a Livingston farmhouse in 1850 was not documenting new wealth. He was documenting the same land grant that had been recorded in Dutch and English colonial deeds more than a century and a half earlier, still intact, still bearing the same name, still worked in many cases by tenant farmers who carried entirely different surnames of their own, farmers whose own descendants would spend much of the 1840s fighting to end the very lease terms that had kept the Livingston name on the deed for so long. Kelly, the second most common surname among Irish famine immigrants, and one that shows up in the 1850 census with almost the same pattern as Murphy. Laborer, no real estate, born in Ireland. A Kelly family recorded in a Philadelphia ward that year might list a father working construction on the railroads, then spreading west from the city, a mother taking in washing, and children as young as 10 already listed with an occupation of their own, rather than a school attendance mark. The wages a Kelly household earned in 1850 went almost entirely toward rent and food, leaving nothing to accumulate into the kind of real estate that would ever show up on a census form. The scale of what drove them out is difficult to overstate. Ireland's population fell from roughly 8 million people in 1841 to about 6 million by 1851, a collapse driven by starvation, disease, and emigration all at once, and no single surname carried more of that history across the Atlantic than Kelly. Some Kelly families had been relatively secure tenant farmers back in Ireland before the potato blight destroyed the crop an entire economy depended on, which makes the blank column in America even starker to look at now. It was not a family that had always been poor. It was a family that had been made poor by a specific historical catastrophe, and whose surname carried that catastrophe into an entirely new country, recorded in a census column with nothing in it, generation after generation, until it finally began to change. Lowell. By 1850, the name belonged to one of the wealthiest industrial families in Massachusetts, and its fortune was recent enough to tell a different kind of story than Virginia's planter names. Francis Cabot Lowell had toured English textile mills in the early 1800s, memorized the mechanical designs the English government refused to let leave the country, and returned home to build power looms that turned raw cotton into finished cloth on an industrial scale for the first time in America. The mill town that grew up around that operation in Massachusetts was named Lowell in his honor, and by 1850 the family's real estate holdings there and in Boston ran well into 6 figures, a fortune built inside 2 generations rather than 6. The mills themselves ran largely on the labor of young women recruited from New England farm families, housed in company boarding houses and paid wages that were, for the time, considered progressive, even as the profits generated by their work flowed almost entirely upward to the family whose name was on the mill. The Lowells belonged to what Boston had already begun calling its Brahmin class, a small circle of merchant and manufacturing families who intermarried, sat on the same charitable boards, and increasingly treated Harvard as something close to a family finishing school. Where the Randolphs and the Livingstons had inherited land, the Lowells had built an industrial fortune from cotton, credit, and the labor of mill workers who themselves rarely appeared anywhere near the top of that real estate column, however many hours they logged inside the mills carrying the family name on their pay stubs. Schmidt. German immigration in the years leading up to 1850 was more economically mixed than Irish immigration, and Schmidt, the German word for smith, reflects that mix better than almost any other name on this list. Some who carried it were 48ers, educated political refugees who had fled the failed revolutions sweeping the German states in 1848 and who arrived with professional training and modest savings intact. Most, though, were farmers and tradesmen leaving overcrowded rural districts in Bavaria, Baden, and the Rhineland, where land holdings had been divided among too many heirs for too many generations to support a growing family. A Schmidt household that landed in Cincinnati or St. Louis in the years before 1850 often fared marginally better than an Irish laborer family arriving the same year, taking up trades like brewing, baking, or cabinet making rather than unskilled day labor. In Cincinnati, German immigrant families clustered so heavily in one district north of the Miami and Erie Canal that residents began calling the neighborhood Over the Rhine, a name that stuck for generations and that still marks the area today. But marginally better still meant almost nothing in the real estate column for most new arrivals. It took years of carefully saved wages before a German immigrant family could purchase land or a house outright, and the 1850 census caught many Schmidt households still in the middle of that waiting period, skilled, steadily employed, and still recorded with a blank, where the Randolphs and the Lowells carried 5- and 6-figure sums. Pinckney. In South Carolina, the name carried the specific weight of rice and cotton, the two crops that made the Low Country around Charleston one of the wealthiest agricultural regions anywhere in the country before the Civil War. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney had signed the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787 and returned home to a plantation economy built on enslaved labor that by 1850 made his descendants among the richest families in the entire state. Historians of the Low Country have documented that the rice cultivation techniques themselves, the flooding cycles and irrigation methods that made Carolina rice so profitable, were largely brought to South Carolina by enslaved people taken from rice-growing regions of West Africa, expertise the planter class depended on completely, while crediting almost none of it in the historical record it left behind. Pinckney real estate holdings recorded in Charleston District that year routinely exceeded $50,000, and that figure did not even include the enslaved people the family held as separate property, recorded not by name, but only by age, sex, and color, on an entirely different census schedule, kept apart from the free population. The wealth in that real estate column and the wealth in that separate nameless schedule were the same wealth, generated by the same rice fields and the same forced labor, and the 1850 census kept the two formally distinct even as anyone examining a Pinckney estate that year would have understood exactly how completely they were connected. A name like Pinckney sat at the very top of the free population's real estate figures precisely because an entire second population beneath it was never permitted a column, a value, or a name of its own at all. A silence built directly into the structure of the census form itself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one, Sullivan. Another of the most common surnames among the Famine generation, concentrated especially among families from County Cork and County Kerry, two of the regions hit hardest by the blight. Sullivan households appear throughout the 1850 census, working canal construction, railroad grading, and dock labor in port cities up and down the Atlantic seaboard, jobs that were dangerous, seasonal, and paid in wages too thin to save. A Sullivan family in 1850 New York might move 3 or 4 times within a single year chasing whatever construction work was available, which is part of why so many Irish households from this period are difficult for their descendants to trace with precision today. Much of that work involved canals and rail lines still being pushed westward through the 1840s and 50s, projects that demanded enormous amounts of cheap labor and offered almost no path toward owning the land the workers were paid to improve. There was no real estate to anchor a Sullivan family to a single parcel of land the way a Randolph or a Livingston family was anchored. There was only the next job, the next tenement, the next ward. The name persisted and eventually prospered in America, particularly once Irish-American families gained footholds in city government and organized labor later in the century. But in 1850, a Sullivan household sitting for the census almost never had anything to report in that real estate column, and the enumerator moved on to the next name without pausing, the way he had for nearly every Irish surname that came before it that day. Van Rensselaer. If Livingston represented old Hudson Valley wealth, Van Rensselaer represented something even larger. Rensselaer's Wick, the patroon estate the family had held since the 1630s under a charter from the Dutch West India Company, was at its height the largest single landholding in New York, stretching across roughly 700,000 acres and encompassing thousands of tenant farms. Stephen Van Rensselaer III, who died in 1839, had been called the last patroon, and even after his death the family's real estate holdings recorded in Albany and Rensselaer counties in 1850 remained staggering by any measure, a landed fortune that had survived the American Revolution, the end of Dutch colonial rule, and more than 2 centuries of inheritance without significant fragmentation. The family's wealth had also become a source of open conflict by 1850. Tenant farmers across the old patroon lands had spent the previous decade in what came to be called the Anti-Rent War, refusing to pay the perpetual leases their families had been bound to for generations, sometimes disguising themselves in calico dresses and masks as they confronted sheriffs sent to collect back rent and serve eviction papers, a movement that came to be called the Anti-Rent War and that dragged on for the better part of a decade before New York courts and legislators finally began dismantling the old leasehold system. The real estate column beside the name Van Rensselaer in 1850 was not simply a number, it was the exact thing thousands of tenant families were actively fighting to escape from underneath. Doyle, an Irish surname carried across the Atlantic in enormous numbers during the famine years, and one that the 1850 census records with the same unforgiving pattern as Murphy, Kelly, and Sullivan. A Doyle family arriving in Boston or New York in the years just before the census often included at least one member who had died on the crossing, in ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that they earned the nickname coffin ships in both Ireland and America, and on some of the worst recorded voyages as many as 1 in 5 passengers did not survive to see land. Those who survived the passage arrived with essentially nothing, and the 1850 census caught many Doyle households only a year or two into their American lives, still learning which neighborhoods offered work, still sending whatever wages they could spare back to relatives who had stayed behind. Some Doyle men found work as laborers on the very railroads that families like the Livingstons and the Lowells owned shares in, a detail the census itself never records but that sits quietly underneath nearly every name on this list. The wealthy families building America's rail and mill fortunes, and the immigrant families laying the track and running the looms carried entirely different surnames and appeared in entirely different rows of the same 1850 ledger, Cabot. Boston had a saying by the middle of the 19th century, one repeated so often it eventually became a piece of local folklore, about how the lodges spoke only to the Cabots, and the Cabots spoke only to God. The joke captured something real about where the family sat in 1850 Massachusetts society. The family traced its American roots to John Cabot, who arrived in Massachusetts by way of the Isle of Jersey in the early 1700s and built the original fortune in shipping out of Salem and Beverly, trading in fish, rum, and other cargo across the Atlantic, some of it in ventures later generations preferred not to discuss in detail. That fortune had shifted into banking and manufacturing investment by the time of the census. Cabot real estate holdings in Boston and Essex County in 1850 reflected generations of careful reinvestment rather than a single lucky venture, the kind of wealth that survives market downturns precisely because it is spread across shipping interests, textile mill shares, and banking positions rather than concentrated in any one asset. The family intermarried with the Lowells, the Lodges, and other Brahmin households so consistently that by 1850 the Boston elite functioned almost like a single extended family, with several different surnames attached to the same underlying fortune, Ryan. Among the most common surnames in County Tipperary and County Limerick, and among the most common names recorded in the tenement wards of American cities by 1850. A Ryan household in that year's census might show a father listed as a laborer, a mother with no occupation recorded at all despite almost certainly working informally, and several children still too young to work crowded into a single rented room. Overcrowding of exactly this kind became such a visible problem in cities like New York that it would prompt formal housing investigations within a decade, including surveys carried out by the city's own Council of Hygiene, reports that repeatedly found Irish surnames like Ryan clustered in the same few blocks, sometimes a dozen or more people sharing a space intended for a single family. The real estate column beside a Ryan entry in 1850 was not simply blank because the family had chosen not to buy property, it was blank because owning property in an American city in 1850 required capital that a laborer's wages, no matter how carefully saved, essentially never produced within one generation. Biddle. In Philadelphia, the name meant banking, and specifically it meant Nicholas Biddle, who had served as president of the Second Bank of the United States through the 1820s and into the 1830s, presiding over what was then the most powerful financial institution in the country, until Andrew Jackson vetoed its recharter and dismantled its federal standing in a political fight that dominated an entire decade of American politics and that many historians later connected to the financial panic of 1837. The Biddle family's real estate and financial holdings in Philadelphia and the surrounding counties remained substantial by 1850, even after the bank war had ended, Nicholas Biddle's public career, because the family's wealth had never depended on a single institution. Biddle sat on the boards of insurance companies, railroads, and merchant banks throughout the city, and the family's real estate entries in that year's census reflected decades of diversified investment rather than land inherited from a single colonial grant. Where a Randolph or a Van Rensselaer carried wealth rooted in land, a Biddle carried wealth rooted in finance itself, in the ability to move capital rather than simply hold acreage, a distinction that would matter enormously as the American economy shifted further toward industry and banking in the decades after 1850, and one reason names tied to finance rather than land often proved even more durable across the generations that followed. Walsh. One more Irish surname common across Galway and Mayo, and one more entry in the 1850 census that follows the pattern established by nearly every Irish name on this list. Laborer, no real estate, recently arrived. A Walsh family settling in a city like Baltimore or New Orleans in the years before the census often found work tied to the docks, loading and unloading the same ships that carried cotton grown on plantations owned by families like the Pinckneys, another quiet connection the census itself never draws but that sat directly underneath the daily lives of both families. In New Orleans specifically, Irish dock workers crowded into the riverfront district later known as the Irish Channel faced some of the highest yellow fever mortality rates in the entire country. A risk taken on because dock labor was often the only work available to a family with no capital and no local connections, and because refusing the work simply meant no wages arrived at the end of the week, regardless of what the season's fever count looked like. Walsh households, like most Irish immigrant households recorded that year, existed almost entirely outside the world of real estate ownership, renting by the week or the month, moving when rent could not be met, building no equity to pass down to the next generation the way a Randolph or a Cabot family did almost automatically. The gap recorded in that single census column between a name like Walsh and a name like Cabot represented not one bad year but centuries of entirely different starting positions, positions that neither family had chosen for itself and that neither family could easily escape within a single generation. What the 1850 census shows, taken as a whole, is not a simple story of hard work rewarded and idleness punished. It is a story of starting positions, some of them set centuries earlier by a colonial land patent or a Dutch trading charter, others set by a famine an ocean away that no family caught inside it could have prevented. The economist Gregory Clark, whose research on surname-linked wealth has traced elite family names across generations in several countries including the United States, found that the advantage carried by a relatively small set of colonial-era American surnames took far longer to fade than most people assume, showing up decades and even a century later in college enrollment records, professional directories, and even life expectancy figures, long after the original land grants themselves had been sold, subdivided, or forgotten by everyone except the county archives that still hold the paperwork. His broader conclusion, drawn from data stretching across England, Sweden, China, and the United States alike, was that social mobility moves far more slowly than most families assume, closer to the pace of centuries than the pace of a single generation, no matter how hard any one household inside that span might work. There is one more column worth mentioning, the one that does not appear beside any surname discussed here at all. The 1850 census recorded the enslaved population of the United States on an entirely separate form, the slave schedule, and on that form no name was ever written down, only age, sex, and color, organized under the name of the person who claimed to own them. Millions of individuals who built the wealth behind names like Pinckney's real estate column were themselves denied a column, a name, or a record of their own that year, a gap that genealogists researching African American ancestry still run directly into today, more than a century and a half later, forcing family history to be pieced together instead through plantation inventories, probate records, and the free schedules of the following decades once emancipation finally allowed a name of one's own to enter the federal record. If you want to look into your own family's 1850 story, the census itself is freely searchable through the National Archives and most major genealogy platforms, and it is worth reading past the name and the age straight to that real estate column, then cross-referencing whatever number you find against county land and probate records from the same decade. Look also at the personal estate column beside it, which recorded the value of everything a household owned that was not land, from livestock to furniture to, in the case of enslaved households, the human beings the law at the time still classified as property. Sometimes the number confirms exactly what family stories have always claimed. Sometimes it tells you something nobody in the family ever mentioned at all, a silence that turns out once you sit with the record long enough, to be exactly as informative as the number itself, and every bit as much a part of your family's story as any name that ever made it into that real estate column at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.